So we'll start out with the good news and the bad news on this chapter. The good news is that Chapter 18 is the last chapter we do. The bad news is Chapter 18 is kind of a beast. It's all on the relatively new revenue recognition standard that for public companies was effective at the beginning of 2018, and for private companies they're going to have to be finishing their implementation by the end of 2019. So relatively new. It changes the whole concept of how revenue was recognized. Why did FASB do this? They use words like, oh, we wanted a more robust framework for revenue recognition. Part of it was also that they wanted more consistency in reporting. With the previous revenue recognition principle, there was a lot of industry-specific guidance. In other words, this industry would account for revenue recognition one way, and other industries would do it another way. Just because, there's a whole lot of different ways to recognize revenue. So they wanted to get a consistent standard that would cover all industries, and it would be converged with the international accounting standards. And so that was the goal. They've been working with the International Accounting Standards Boards for quite a few years to come up with this, and they've come up with it. So it's really, it supersedes all of the other revenue recognition you might have learned in the past. If you had run into it before, it was that the revenue is recognized when it's been earned and is either received or receivable, realized or realizable, the way they like to put it. So that's all out the window. The new revenue recognition is based on contracts. Okay, but before I get into the specific principle, I want to get into a little of, how's the implementation been going? I mean, and you think that as a student it's hard to sort of start all over and learn a whole new concept of revenue recognition. Imagine if you're a corporation with a gazillion accounts and all of a sudden you've got to change all your IT systems to accommodate this new revenue recognition. You've probably got to change your internal controls. A whole different concept for gathering the information. So if you think it's bad for you, it was worse for them. They had a couple of ways they could implement it. FASB, does have some sympathy for people. They could use what's called a modified retrospective method, which means that they did not have to restate any previous years, but they would have to keep two sets of books for the year they transitioned from the old to the new revenue recognition. The other was the full retrospective, and that way when they present their financial statements, they would have to have restated 3 years of financial statements to present as if they had been using the new method. Okay, so that's, as far as how's the implementation going, I got a bunch of numbers in the notes. I'm not going to read them all to you, but basically, the word they've used is challenging. Most of the companies that have done it so far have thought it was a lot more work than they thought it would be. It's cost quite a bit of money to make the transition. And I guess the major challenges they faced were, okay, so we have to reevaluate. This is all based on contracts with customers now. And so they have to reevaluate what are these various contracts with the customers. And then the disclosures, there's a lot more disclosure in the new principle, and that's also been problematic. Performance obligations are part of it, and they have to deal with all of that, as well as what they call variable consideration and the timing of revenue recognition. So it's all fairly complex, but of course their goal was to simplify. Okay, so there's a lot of judgment calls. It's much more principle-based than the old standard, just because international standards are much more principles-based. So anyway, we'll be looking into we'll be, working to understand the revenue recognition. For this chapter, I would suggest strongly that as you read each learning objective, like read learning objective 1, then go back to the end of the chapter and just write out the questions or do the questions, however you learn it. But I actually went through them in class, and also the brief exercises that go with each section. There's just a lot of terminology here, yeah, so you're going to probably be better off if you do put in that kind of effort with this chapter. Okay, so I will move on to a little more detail on the new standard next.